Hello, dear friends. Today is the 4th of June, Wednesday. I apologize in advance for my slight negligence. Today was a dramatic day. I will tell you everything, you will understand. I would compare it with one of the hottest days of the Caribbean War. It all started quite early when I read the first material. I came from Moscow, from the Reuters agency, in which it was said that Moscow said on Wednesday that the military options of Russia are on the table to respond to the Ukrainian attacks in the depths of Russia. Russia also blamed the West for their involvement. Europe and the United States of America belong to the West, despite the fact that Trump publicly denied that this did not happen. Russia also called on the United States of Great Britain to hold back Kiev after the attack, which Ukrainian officials praised as a demonstration that Kiev can still resist after more than 3 years of war. Then the ambassador of the United States of Trump in Ukraine said that the risk of escalating the war has increased significantly after the attack on bombers with nuclear weapons. A week earlier, Trump denied President Putin for a fierce air attack on Ukraine. At about the same time, plus or minus an hour, Putin was speaking in Moscow at a video conference. I don't know who he was speaking to. And there was a video in which he actually said that the attacks that Ukraine took place, including those that took place in Bryansk and Kursk oblasts. I really didn't hear if there were any bombings or not. In general, these attacks, the last ones in Ukraine, are terrorist acts. And like we can't have negotiations with terrorists, why would we give them such bribes or gifts as a ceasefire? And in general, the question arises, what kind of negotiations can there be in general? And then I'll tell you how much it is important. At about 12:04 p.m., Donald Trump, the President of the United States, places on his page, in True Social, where he writes himself. He writes what is called a readout. That is, an official report or message about the phone conversation he had with Putin the day before. It is very important that he wrote here, so I'll read it all to you now, because you won't be able to see it soon if you see it again. So, attention, now there is no message on this page, so read it. Such a thing happens rarely. This is worthy of what happened today, of the thrilling trailer about, let's say, the state coup that took place in Washington near Columbia. So 12.4 Trump writes, I just finished a phone conversation with the president of Russia, Putin. The conversation lasted about 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack of Ukraine on Russian planes that were parked on the pier, as well as other attacks that were carried out by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not the one that will lead to an immediate peace. President Putin really said, and very decisively, that he will have to answer for the recent attack on airfields. We also discussed Iran and the fact that the time for Iran to make a decision on nuclear weapons is running out. And this decision must be made quickly. I told President Putin that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, and in this, as it seems to me, we agreed with him. President Putin suggested taking part in discussions with Iran and possibly help him in the immediate completion of this issue. I believe that Iran is slow in making a decision on this very important issue, and we will need a final answer in a very short time. June 12, 1944, 1925. It's been about 2 hours and this post is disappearing. In general, when I read this post, I experienced a somewhat shocking, almost shocking state because it was like a coup. Well, not quite, let's say, a coup. It was a dramatic decision that fundamentally changed the foreign policy of the United States, at least in terms of Russia-Ukraine relations, the war of Russian aggression on the territory of Ukraine. It also, by and large, fundamentally changed the foreign policy of the United States and the United States in America in many ways. It also completely changed the position that Trump was still occupying, positioning himself as a successful negotiator. Only he can solve the biggest, most difficult international issues, especially when it comes to talks with so-called external dictators or autocrats. And when I read all this, I immediately began to write analytical material in order to explain what happened. Because this is really. This message is a proclamation, an announcement of dramatic changes. First of all, friends, for my dear listeners, because this is primarily directly related to them. When I finished all this, and it took, so to speak, about 2 hours, I wrote a couple of dozen pages here, and I was already ready to record the video. My son called me and said, "Incredible, this post of Trump written on the most important foreign policy issue written by him disappears from his pages in his social network, True Social. Instead, there is a link to the article in Washington Post, which was written and published in the newspaper on May 29, which reports about a completely different, completely different on 180 degrees, positions of Trump's administration, Congress, and so on. I will not tell you all this article, I will give you a headline. The Congress can give Trump pressure levers on Putin. The two-party bill of sanctions provided, you remember, the bill of Senator Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal. So this bill of sanctions will provide Trump pressure levers to make Russia stop the war in Ukraine. In general, according to our thesis, which we discussed with you, dear friends. Instead of holding peaceful talks with President Donald Trump, Russian leader Putin is strengthening his attacks on innocent Ukrainian citizens. He sends rockets to cities and kills people, said Trump this week. I don't like it at all. Obviously, the newspaper continues that Putin does not want peace. He needs to be forced to stop the war. To do this, Trump needs wider levers of influence. The Congress can provide him by adopting the law on sanctions against Russia, a two-party initiative headed by Senator Graham and Blumenthal. That's what happened. It was a tactical nuclear explosion in the information space. Well, that is, there are two posts that exclude each other in the direction of foreign policy of the United States of America. And in general, not only in Ukraine, not only in the war, not only in relation to Russia, but in general, how this administration presents itself with foreign policy. One is to disband, once again to disband Trump, to disband Putin and express him complete humility. The other is the opposite. On the contrary, what we wanted, what we liked, what we discussed, what all the healthy people of Trump have been calling for a long time. What does this mean by and large? Well, first of all, that is, such changes happen when there is a coup d'etat or a palace coup d'etat. Well, something like that. That is, it is not easy to remove all this from the report of the president about his own conversation with his own theses and replace your tone with a completely different meaning. What does this mean? So I can express my thoughts. Well, first of all, this is a testimony of a kind of coup d'etat. Trump's post about a good conversation with Putin has caused a sharp criticism, undoubtedly, even from the side of not only the Democrats, but even Yastrебov from the Republican Party. His closest advisors, only they could do this, make him change something, remove the fruit of their analytical work. Only they could, and perhaps people from a conditional group. He has already formed a group of technocrats, healthy people, who are treated by Secretary of State Rubin, then Minister of Finance Besant. And I have already called you this name. This is one of, they can be called military technical companies, and now it is also a company of artificial intelligence. The influence of which, the effectiveness and consequences of their significant activities have grown so much that they are now entering the top 3 in Washington. And not only Washington, I will say. So Rubin, Minister of Finance Besant and Palantir, a company that has already appeared almost from the very beginning during the war, is providing a great help to Ukraine. These are just the ones who could convince him or remove the post so as not to set themselves up in the intentional sabotage of American foreign policy. This is how, by and large, here inside, they evaluated his first post. That is, the president is sabotaging, killing American foreign policy with his post. Well, and then the replacement for the article of the Washington Post, almost a week ago, well, a little less than a week ago, in a completely opposite sense, so combat, as should be the policy of the United States against the aggressor, against Russia. And it was, so to speak, a reference to this replacement of his post, a reference to this newspaper. It should have served as an attempt to show that I am for sanctions. I, Donald Trump, for sanctions. That is, he posts, makes a reference to this newspaper. That is, I approve of it. That is, I just play very cunningly. In fact, I approve of it, but sometimes I say stupid things there about the fact that it is a good conversation with Putin. But this is a game, this is not just a fool, you do not perceive it. I play so cunningly. Well, that is, this is not a coup, but an obvious sign of an internal split. Well, plus, this could also mean the replacement of this discrediting. Trump's policy for the delay of a really serious approach to the regulation of the war of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and change it to a more multi-course but active strategy. Well, some think that Trump himself could have realized over the past 2 hours that he had talked too much in his post, that he discredited him completely. That is, after this post, there is no doubt that he himself understands what role he plays, and many, many people have long known what role he plays. And after that, it will be bad for him first of all. But this appeared with noise, that is, with a squall probably of those calls that entered the White House almost immediately, as at 12:04 he made this post. And now he wipes it off, he now rolls it back to maintain the visibility of the distance, so to speak, from the Kremlin. In his post, he lies literally under the Kremlin, under Putin, and now he rolled it off, he took the position again, the royal in the bushes. Now the Congress, Lindsey Graham comes out, and he is a thin politician for whom the Congress will now give a nod in the form of this bill, and he will seriously press on Putin. That's how we discussed it with you. What does he need to do, and why does he need Lindsey Graham's bill? But there is also such a semi-conspiracy, semi-spy version. There is such an assumption that someone from the intelligence community of the United States of America, who knew that Trump was informed about the upcoming strike of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles on Russian bombers. Well, they reported and reported to Trump that if he didn't think about it and didn't remove his post, then there would be a leak of information, where it would turn out that the President of the United States was at the same time. At this time, Ryabkov was already in Moscow, kicking his feet and screaming that the United States and Great Britain actively participated in the organization of this drone strike on Russian airfields. And it turns out that Trump was aware of the matter. And what? Well, this is a scandal already. This is a complete scandal. Therefore, they removed him so that there would be legal protection of the president in the event of a possible investigation in Congress. That is, it is possible or not possible. 50-50, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it all looks like, well, not that it looks like, but it was real, the so-called cleaning of digital traces in the light of possible hearings or leaks of information. That is, this is not a coup d'etat, but rather a palace coup d'etat or a speech. The palace ones gathered together and finally found the strength to make a speech to the main king, the president. And before that, it was necessary a lot because he was a God-given king. 100 days ago, after the victory, inauguration, the president who controls almost all branches of power except the judiciary, under the control, as he believed, of the Supreme Court in his pocket, that is, few people could object to him. Well, they objected. From this follows. In any case, it is possible with a significant share of probability to assume that the center of gravity in the implementation of politics, at least externally in Washington, carefully moves from Trump to the American version of the security forces. And it has strengthened the feeling that Trump is no longer the only conductor in the orchestra, and someone intercepts from him or has already intercepted a stick. And this, I will tell you, is very good news. It is time on this 100-day period to put an end to the rifts from side to side and finally to introduce a mind, a cold mind, in what is happening with the foreign policy of the United States. What would you understand more? I will make a structural analysis of the text of his initial post, which I prepared for you before it was filmed, and there was a link to the Washington Post article. This is very important because this was the main idea of Trump, and he is probably still in his head. And he can probably try to repeat this option with his Kremlin friend. Therefore, it is important to know what they agreed on and what they were going to do until all this was prevented. When I read this post, I first of all had an allegory in my head. Imagine 1943. British Air Force just bombed airfields on the territory of fascist Germany, where there were bombers who had previously bombed Coventry, Manchester, other cities of Great Britain. And then Hitler calls Roosevelt and complains that the British are committing terrorist acts on the airfields of the Third Reich, defenseless, where there are peaceful bombers. And he threatens with what he will answer. And President Roosevelt nods. It does not object to such a question, does not judge, does not urge Hitler to rethink, to look at the situation in a sober way and to come to his senses, but instead he asks the Führer to help Roosevelt to regulate relations with Japan. You can imagine how crazy this conversation was. Of course this is The kind of conversation with a reference to historical analogies that have their flaws and conditions. Look, that structural analysis of Trump's post, which I immediately made when I was preparing the material before it was deleted. The post is clearly written for the internal electorate in order to preserve the image of a peacemaker who controls the situation on two continents, Ukraine and Iran. Then the formula: it was a good conversation, but this conversation that will not lead to an immediate peace, it will lead someday. Well, maybe again in 2 weeks, or maybe then in 2 weeks, but the conversation is exceptionally good. But this is, by and large, a pseudo-realism that creates an illusion that a person, like, controls the situation, is actively involved in it, continues to work, but however, takes on all kinds of responsibility. So now, yes, it will not work. Someday, I don't know, but nevertheless. Then we move on to the assessment of the hit in the Ukrainian drones by the peaceful bombardier. That is, Trump actually confirmed the fact of the hit. But by and large, he did not judge any side. Both sides were in the same situation. That is, they exchanged, discussed other blows from both sides. That is, the victim was equated to the aggressor. There is no difference based on what Trump wrote. There is no difference between the aggressor and the victim of aggression. If there is no difference, then, by and large, what is there to help someone? Both, by and large, are to blame. They are exchanged blows, both sides are to blame. Therefore, what is especially to worry about and why to help? By and large, let them somehow decide. That is, this is actually 100% the position in favor of the Kremlin. And this, by and large, legitimizes the hit of the Russian side. They're peaceful bombardier missiles, according to the Ukrainian civil infrastructure. That is exactly what the strategic goal and tactical goals of the Russian Federation are achieved. His concern, Putin's reaction, is most of all what worries him. Please note what he refers to. That Putin very decisively said that he would have to answer. The situation is such that there is nowhere for Putin to go. Ukraine put him in such an awkward position and he just has nowhere to go. He is forced to answer. That is, he is not interested in the problems of Ukraine, that it was Ukraine that responded to the fact that before that Russia had sent hundreds of drone missiles to objects in Ukraine. His sympathy on the part of Putin, sympathy somewhere that Putin is forced to answer. As for Ukraine, muto fonarian. And so he ends up with Ukraine by and large. He doesn't even set a deadline for 2 weeks. Now it won't work. And when? God knows when. That is everything they turned the question. Both sides are to blame. But what was the purpose of Trump's cheap politics in relation to Russia, in particular Russia, because the cheap policy in relation to other countries was the same, by and large? After all, everywhere was cheap, the #1 goal, but here it turns out Trump previously wanted to get some kind of cheap in. Material form or in the form of some political, economic benefits. Well, the same rare earth metals or some other political interests, all this it turns out, but once then it all turns out. Once by and large Putin has nothing to do with negotiations about Ukraine because Putin will still answer. And what then turns out, then hangs in Congress the bill of Senators Graham and Blumenthal. It is necessary to somehow get friend Vova out of shock, and then there is a mortal assault, a brilliant move. Trump says immediately here, he goes from Ukraine to Iran and reports that with Iran a difficult situation arose. It is necessary to immediately solve the issue of the fact that uranium does not have nuclear weapons. And he invites Putin to take part to help the United States achieve this very important goal. Because, well, there is no time, everything is in short, and this is just, well, as the Jesuit move, as from the point of view of Machiavelli, this is brilliant. As for, well, moral, ethical norms in general, the common sense of the 21st century, this is just monstrous. Let us remember that it was Trump in 2018. This is the first month, in fact, in his first condensation. When he collapsed, he left. The United States left him from this agreement, from a nuclear agreement with Iran. He is to blame for the fact that Iran, since the United States has come to an agreement, Iran has ceased to adhere to his position. And now it's time to turn things around. And Iran said, well, Iran talked, and then waved at him when it was not a serious person and said, go away, we will not talk to you. And now Vova helped, that is, Trump attracts Putin, the aggressor, the military criminal, the bloodshed of millions of people. Or he attracts him as an ally of the United States, who must help the United States to solve the issue with Iran, otherwise they cannot solve it without Putin. So what are the sanctions against him? What are you? Now he will say to Senator Graham, guys, well, it was not possible to introduce sanctions before. It was necessary for me to adjust, to achieve results in positive negotiations in Ukraine, and now sanctions cannot be introduced because Putin helps us with Iran. To involve him in the contract, which I in 2018 myself and broke down, just phenomenal, just phenomenal. Here is such a gentleman's situation has happened. That is, the substitution of concepts, the subject of the conversation, the transfer to an unfavorable object. In order to remove the threat of sanctions, even if everything is in Ukraine, no matter what happens, it is necessary to remove Putin, to withdraw from under the sanctions. In order to do this, it is necessary to insert him into the Iranian project. Well, here is a dramatic formula. Time is running out, that's it, the end. The motherland is in danger, the United States, the whole world is in danger. If Iran has nuclear weapons, only Putin can save the whole world. This is the height Trump raises Putin. What do you think? I think Elon Musk said this, right? What do you think, Elon Musk? What do you think, Mr. Machiavelli? Well, analyzing this bright example of political art, a la Machiavelli, I came to the conclusion that I read this Trump message, and they talked for an hour and 15 minutes. And to what conclusion should Moscow have come? Moscow should have felt that it could be traded. Well, the man is working for Putin again. It didn't work out. The mask, the transition. That is, the second option is even better with Iran, because Putin is involved in the family of civilized peoples in the Western civilization, back as a savior of this Western civilization. From the threat of a nuclear bomb armed with teeth by Iran, do you understand what is happening? Then Kiev will understand that Trump is keeping the distance and will possibly look for other forms of influence on the White House. Then what would have happened if it had been written? The State Department, the intelligence community, the Congress, they would have shaken, they would have felt the harshest sense of tension. That is, involvement from the point of view of common sense and any crazy head here in Washington and Columbia. Putin's involvement in nuclear negotiations with Iran on the side of the United States is strategic madness. Madness unacceptable from the point of view of control over the Middle East. Therefore, what would have happened in this case? This, again, would have been like a copper tactical nuclear warhead in Washington and Columbia. Waves from which would spread all over the world. That is, it would no longer be politics, not geopolitics. It would be like a farce barter exchange, where the players behave like the last day, as if tomorrow would never come. That is, it seemed that Trump realized that with peace in Ukraine, he would not only get from Putin a gizmo, he would not even get sympathy from Putin. That is, earlier he asked for at least some kind of concession from the other side for Putin to negotiate. He had already come up with this concession. It was Trump who came up with it. Why? To show the world that he had achieved it. And he asked Putin, well, yes, Putin, in a mockery, instead of 30, offered 2 days of peace, as much as he could. But this is humiliation, a complete humiliation for Trump. That is, he realized that he would not get from Putin. He would not put pressure on him on the issue of war in Ukraine, not only cheap, real, big. Like, I pulled you out of a serious situation, seriously, Zamarsky, you owe me now, and you have a lot of rare earth metals. Putin promised him access to them. And now everything is over with Ukraine. But even in this situation, Trump is trying to do something useful for Putin. And for this, he involves him in this Iranian project. And now he will slow down the sanctions. That is, if this post continued to hang, he would have managed to make his administration and Congress obey the program laid out. That is, here the program is like this. We switch and we switch Putin, we switch and we switch Putin from Ukraine to Iran, and now we will slow down the sanctions. And then, in a big way, you can ask a question about the cancellation of the partial sanctions. But Putin helps us to save the world from nuclear war, and now there was no breakthrough from Ukraine. Now Putin will help us with the breakthrough with Iran. So let's fix it. With this post, Trump actually admitted that the world he was supposed to achieve in 24 hours, and to show himself as an incredible peacemaker and master of all negotiations, he completely failed. The game of peacekeepers is over. This is a defeat, and we need to keep in mind who he was defeated by. He was defeated by a dude who, as you know, when he worked in the State Security Committee, from his close colleagues in terms of his personal and business qualities, he deserved the nickname Bloody Mole in Akurak. This is how Akurak made the President of the United States, and it's not his fault, not Akurak, because Akurak is eternal. He can't get rid of it. It's the fault of the one who is now taking the post of the President of the United States of America. Now, what else did this post mean? Now, a sharp turn in politics. Now Trump is betting on a new track, the Iranian map, where now Putin turns into an intermediary. This would allow Trump, as he hoped, not to lose face and continue the rhetoric that he controls the situation. He is again in charge of all the branches in his hands, and he is pulling the strings. And at the same time, he does not need to run to a tough anti-Russian line, which is extremely important for him. This is a red line, a taboo. He should not do anything against Putin, by and large, against the Kremlin. And it's even better to partially remove the sanctions for the help that Putin would have provided on the Iranian track. And the most important thing, yes, is to sabotage to a lesser extent, and also to remove the sanctions that already exist and not to accept in Congress. The bill by Graham Blumenthal, what would have happened in Congress? In Congress, Trump would have tied Blumenthal and Graham sanctions. With a nuclear issue that interests everyone, and the issue is very serious. What do you want, to break the nuclear deal and put the world on the brink of a nuclear war with your sanctions, and don't even think about it? And it would have been serious because for a large mass of people, for the magic supporters of Trump, to say that there are two senators, an ostrich, one of them is Graham, another one is Blumenthal. They want a nuclear war to be fought, and now there is a very serious political situation. That is, Trump has done a lot in 100 years, in 100 days, in order to blow up not only his positions, but also the Republican Party. Unseen things are happening. Graham, he is a senator from the state of South Carolina, such a firm Republican state. And recently there were elections to a legislative meeting like the Congress of the state. And in the 50th district, where the Democrat never won the election, it was a firm Republican state. And suddenly, with a 40% gap, a 24-year-old Democrat will win there. This is, again, like an explosion of a tactical nuclear weapon, by the way. And Graham himself, who also has to defend his positions, fight for re-election, he is also in a very tricky position. And others, and so on, all over the country, by and large. Therefore, all these political games, they will certainly show a direct impact on the political fate of those who will re-election in November of the next year. That is, if this post had stayed there and his main ideas had begun to be carried out in life, then it would mean that from one diplomatic fake, the administration would switch to another fake. That is, with Ukraine, allegedly the desire of the administration to regulate humanly, within the framework of international law, the war on the territory of Ukraine. They would switch to the regulation in Iran. And the main thing there would be not the achievement of a truly real goal, but the involvement of the poor people back into the Western world. Not the omission of new sanctions, preferably also the removal of the previous ones. That is, it was actually a ritual mask of failure, in which he still played on Putin's side in the hope of getting some kind of carrot from him one day, one way or another. Next, what would happen if the post had stayed, his ideas had begun to be carried out in life? What would it mean in Congress? What would it look like? Well, Republicans, not to mention Democrats, of course, would be in madness. Even the so-called Republicans, i.e. the Reaganists, the neocons, they would also be in madness. Their representative is Lindsey Graham. That is, it would turn out how it would look. After this Tsushima, and I call Tsushima the hit of Ukrainian drones on the peaceful Russian bombers, why Tsushima? Because at first, some observers and analysts used the term Pearl Harbor. Well, the term Pearl Harbor is not bad either, but Pearl Harbor, it did not end up completely catastrophic for the United States of America. America recovered and struck and defeated Japan, and Tsushima is where the Russian fleet was defeated by the Japanese in 1905. And it was a defeat after that defeat followed, therefore I hope that this is still Tsushima. This is Tsushima for Russia, in this case, the second. Once the first time it was at sea, now it concerned the Air Force. That is, after this Tsushima, which was a miracle, just an operation in its effectiveness and complexity, and a clear implementation. After the refusal of Moscow to negotiate in Istanbul from any real concessions. After they put forward these monstrous demands with their completely idiotic memorandums, which had no chance to be considered at all. And Trump suddenly claims that Trump will help us with Iran. And with this message he goes to congressmen, senators, that is, it's just madness. What would happen to the factions? The factions of Lindsey Graham, Blumenthal, and supporters of the law on sanctions, and there are already 82 of them. That is, it would be a tough public condemnation. Like the president is playing naive diplomacy, if you put it mildly. This is not a business contract, but a nuclear threat and an attack on an ally. These would be the messages, and even tougher, we have come to the question of why he is doing this in principle. Let's get to the point. What is his goal in all this? Why, for the sake of Putin, suffer, making a blow to his own political reputation, career? Well, his career is coming to an end. Nevertheless, he makes a blow to the party members, meaning the upcoming elections. Then Johnson, the speaker. Recently, in the previous one, we said that he seemed to have spoken out for the fact that he too is for tough sanctions against Russia. And for this, he should have heard at least some encouraging moan from Trump's side. Well, what now? What should the speaker do now? How will he look? He also wants to be a speaker. Well, as for the Democrats, that's all. He would be accused, probably fairly, of the threat of national security of the United States of America. That's all articles of impeachment. And now we are waiting for November. The composition of the representatives' chambers is changing there, and this process begins immediately. This is what the initial post of Trump meant. The risk of Trump was that even a significant part of the Republican Party could still bypass him if it saw that the price for loyalty to Trump was already overpriced and would damage the prospect of their re-election in the upcoming presidential elections. Europe, from the side of Europe, a reaction. Well, you understand that Europe would scream, step on your feet. It would be a shame, a weakness. That is, Europe would not be silent. There you would see in capitals such as Berlin, Paris, London that Trump, he actually works for Putin. He worked for him and lost to Ukraine. Now he is trying to prevent new sanctions, remove the old one by involving Putin, return him back, including to Europe. This is a terrible thought, a terrible idea for Europeans. What actions would follow after the words? Germany, France, as it is believed, would activate parallel sanctions initiatives. Perhaps through the EU without the United States of America, aiming at the SWIFT, the liquidation of the SWIFT, not in technology. Great Britain, here is an interesting question. In 2017, Great Britain bypassing this is the first condensation of Trump when he began to show difficulties in communication with the Western world, with the European world. Great Britain, bypassing the White House, entered into direct contact with the Congress and thus successfully solved important issues for Great Britain. Perhaps this. So the same channel was opened, perhaps even now, if Trump went to what he tried to go to at 12.4 today during the day. That is, Great Britain would open consultations with the Congress around the White House. When there was an investigation into the ties of Trump with the Russian Federation. Then Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states. There would be a lightning strike, a media strike on Trump as an ally of Putin at the moment of the greatest threat to these countries. That is, this is treason, the slogan of treason of the Western world. Well, the general trend would be an accelerated break of transatlantic unity. The European Union would become more active in looking for new architects to support Ukraine. From Japan, new, yes, I called you this name, companies of so-called military technical, and now they are still companies of artificial intelligence, like Palantir. Well, no matter what would happen in the American media, there would be a fight here, just a fight. In general, with such a thesis, a headline, Trump sacrificed the interests of Ukraine to get the gist of the Kremlin. As a result, he lost to Putin, to Ukraine in the face of Zelensky, and to the Congress. That's all. That is, it would be the beginning of the revolution, as a result of which the Congress would push him to independent steps in an attempt to overcome the presidential veto, which was already warned by Blumenthal and Graham, and they have the opportunity, then the tendency, to accelerate European autonomy from the United States of America. The most active attempts would have been made to weaken Trump as the chief architect of the deal. Ukraine starts and ends with Iran on all major foreign policy issues. That is, to take away from him the influence of the authorities in these spheres and hand over the technocrats and the power of the so-called digital control. And here comes both Rubio and the Minister of Finance to the dissent. And again, they call the company volunteer. Well, as a result, Putin's factor would have become toxic. He is already toxic, and after that, he would have become inextricable. That is, he still appears as an invisible, as if an invisible beneficiary of the foreign policy line that Trump is conducting. Everyone understands that he gets some benefits from this. But they don't really talk about it, do they? And after that, he would have become a public, not just a beneficiary, he would have become a public shame of Trump. And this would have helped to create this image, these destructive statements that Putin allows himself in relation to Trump, his behavior. Then, Putin's general, so to speak, attitude or position of the Kremlin, which Trump, on the other hand, puts before the whole world as a joke intermediary, which the Kremlin does not even ask to get into these intermediaries. Well, he's mumbling something, laughing at him like that, humiliatingly. This is the image he deserved over the past 100 days. Well, with such a development of events, it would be easier for the Congress to demand sanctions, not to be afraid of accusations of undermining peaceful initiatives. There are no peaceful initiatives here. It is necessary to save a breakthrough or a hole in the national security system and the country. That is, as a result of this post, if it were not removed, the probability with a great deal of probability would have grown. The organized one would have arisen and grown significantly. The organized position of Trump inside the ruling party in Congress. If even the terms were not called for me, if he had not somehow intercepted the initiative on some issue during this month, which would have made him forget. And by the way, he has already thrown this question. He has already put a thesis that if we do not introduce these tariffs in full, then America is over. It turned out, after the 250-year existence of the United States of America, that now either America will introduce these tariffs and shake out the mass of money from all countries of the world, or America is over. That is, it began to exist normally in the conditions of a free economy, globalism, such organizations, in the conditions of the work of such organizations, such as the International Labor Organization and all that stuff. America simply cannot. That is, either this is a trade war or the end of the United States. This trend will continue to grow. Well, it is expected that as a result of all this, Reagan-Trump may collapse below 40%. And that's it then, that's it. That's the situation, gentlemen. It happened after 12 hours and 40 minutes today, and it lasted for about 2 hours. Well, it ended literally in 2 hours. The disappearance of this post is an unprecedented option. The appearance of a link from Washington Post, which is largely a witness to the fact that Trump's strategy, his attempts to involve Putin in American politics, not only in American politics, but also in the West, to save them from sanctions again, has failed, also a witness to the fact that there was a fairly strong grouping in the White House among his closest associates. I have already named these people. First of all, he is the Secretary of State Rubio, Minister of Finance Besant. These are key figures in the government of the United States by tradition. Apparently, there is an influential force in the intelligence community, Some sources say that the director of CIA, Sir Ratcliffe, is probably related to them. I don't know, I can't say because he used to be just a blind dog lover to Trump. I don't know if he is able to be free of independent judgment. But Trump, on the other hand, brought the country to such a state that there is nowhere else to go. This is like in Russian history, when the fate of Pavel I was decided. Because it was impossible to endure. Well, it is possible, of course, that these are the leaders of the Congress and so on. That is a fairly strong grouping that could neglect the support and influence that Trump used and that he exploited for the last few months in the ranks of, first of all, a mage, a supporter of a mage. And this group forced it. It had to be forced. That is, Trump is not so simple that he was afraid to make it on the computer to remove these priceless thoughts. And this, yes, it needed a serious foundation, a serious influence, and apparently there were arguments. Not only the conviction, not only Pryanik, apparently, and some Knut was also involved. And so it was turned into a normal course. Well, again, all this is conditional because you see, the famous wisdom of the ancients, everything is flowing, everything is changing. I have acquired in Washington under Trump the character of a farce. That is, it flows so violently in different directions at the same time, and so often changes that they simply do not have time to follow it. But today's demarche was so unprecedented and so serious that we will hope that it won the line of conditional common sense, which represents the so-called deep state. That is, it is the professionals who know what and how to do it. That is, madness and the era of voluntary decisions, apparently, is coming to an end, or it has already stopped. Well, the whole thing will go into the hands of professionals. They can be called so. They told me conditionally our American security forces, let's hope. I, of course, cannot attribute to their number the Minister of Defense Hexit. Well, not at all. Apparently there is some deputy or someone planted a deputy instead of him. That is, the situation changed dramatically over the course of 2 hours and turned in the direction that is favorable and should please all our dear friends, viewers, listeners of this channel. And well, as they say, the fight continues. Therefore, I would like to welcome today's successful development of events. As usual, glory to Ukraine by the armed forces. The enemy will be defeated. The victory will be ours. Dear friends, support, courage, and firm faith in our inevitable victory. I will tell you further in the following videos. There is still a lot that is hidden behind the scenes. Those forces that were involved took part in these events. Those forces that are little spoken about because they do not know them well, who are on the side of Ukraine and help her in her difficult struggle. Therefore, dear friends, for our victory and until we meet again.